Some people carry their strength quietly hidden beneath an ordinary exterior. They walk among us looking just like everyone else, till the moment comes when their true nature is revealed. What happens when someone mistakes quiet confidence for weakness? What happens when bullies target the wrong person? This is the story of Sarah Mitchell, a woman whose past was written in classified missions and whose present was about to collide with a group of cadets who had no idea they were about to learn the hardest lesson of their lives. Sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one who looks like they don't belong there at all. In a world where appearances can deceive and assumptions can be deadly, one woman's secret was about to turn a routine day into an unforgettable lesson about respect, courage, and the price of underestimating someone who has already proven they can survive anything. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Naval Academy grounds as Sarah Mitchell walked through the main gates, her civilian clothes making her stand out among the uniformed cadets who moved with practiced precision across the campus. At 35, she had the kind of understated presence that most people overlooked. Average height, brown hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, wearing jeans and a plain navy sweater. Nothing about her appearance suggested the extraordinary life she had lived or the skills that lay dormant beneath her calm exterior. Sarah was here for a simple reason. Her younger brother Jake had asked her to pick up some documents from his academic advisor before his deployment overseas. Jake was in his final year at the academy, and like most military families, theirs had learned to handle logistics efficiently, especially when time was short. She had driven 3 hours from her small coastal town in Maine to do this favor, thinking it would be a quick in-and-out trip. The campus buzzed with the controlled energy that military institutions carried. Cadets moved between buildings with purpose, their uniforms crisp, their bearing confident. Sarah observed them with the trained eye of someone who had once walked these same paths, though not at this institution. Her own military service had taken a very different trajectory, one that had led her through doors most people didn't even know existed. As she navigated toward the administrative building, Sarah noticed a group of senior cadets gathered near the monument in the center of the quad. They were clearly upperclassmen, their uniforms bearing the marks of rank that indicated they were among the academy's elite. Their laughter carried across the open space, loud and confident in the way that young men often were when they felt they owned their environment. Sarah paid them little attention as she walked past, focused on finding Building C where Jake's advisor had his office. The campus was larger than she had expected, and despite the clear signage, she found herself momentarily disoriented. She paused near a bench to check the map on her phone, unconsciously adopting the relaxed posture of someone comfortable in their own space. This moment of stillness caught the attention of Cadet Marcus Webb, a tall, broad-shouldered young man who served as one of the senior class leaders. Marcus was the kind of cadet who had never met a challenge he couldn't overcome through sheer force of personality and physical presence. He was destined for Marine Corps leadership, and his confidence bordered on arrogance. To Marcus, the Naval Academy was his domain, and everyone in it was either above him in the chain of command or beneath his notice. Seeing Sarah standing alone, clearly trying to figure out where she was going, Marcus exchanged a glance with his companions. There was something about her that struck him as out of place. She wasn't dressed like faculty, wasn't old enough to be a parent visiting for official business, and she certainly didn't carry herself with the deference that civilian visitors usually showed on a military campus. "Hey!" Marcus called out, his voice carrying the authority he was accustomed to wielding. "You lost or something?" Sarah looked up from her phone, meeting his gaze with calm brown eyes. "Just looking for Building C," she replied simply, her voice steady and untroubled. There was no anxiety in her posture, no hurried explanation of why she was there. This struck Marcus as odd. Most civilians on campus, especially women visiting alone, tended to be more deferential, more obviously aware that they were in a space dominated by military authority. Marcus walked over, his 3 companions following. James Chen, David Rodriguez, and Tyler Brooks were all cut from similar cloth, as their leader intelligent, physically capable, and used to being the apex predators in their environment. They had spent 4 years learning to command, to project authority, and to expect compliance from those around them. "Building C is over there," Marcus said, pointing toward a distant structure. "But I'm curious what civilian business you have with our academic staff." His tone wasn't quite hostile, but it carried an undertone of suspicion that suggested Sarah needed to justify her presence. Sarah studied Marcus for a moment, taking in his bearing, the way his companions had positioned themselves, the slight edge in his voice. She had encountered this type many times in her career. Young, competent, convinced of their own superiority, and unused to having their authority questioned. In different circumstances, she might have found it amusing. "Family business," she answered. keeping her response brief and non-committal. She had learned long ago that the less information you gave to people looking for a reason to assert dominance, the better. She started to walk toward Building C, assuming the conversation was over. But Marcus wasn't done. Something about Sarah's calm dismissal rankled him. He was used to deference from visitors, and her casual attitude struck him as disrespectful. In his world, respect for military authority wasn't optional, and her apparent indifference to his status felt like a challenge. "Hold on," he said, his voice sharper now. "I asked you a question." Sarah stopped and turned back, her expression still calm, but with a subtle shift that someone more experienced might have recognized as a warning. "And I answered it," she said quietly. The tension in the group was beginning to escalate, though none of the cadets recognized it for what it was. They saw a civilian woman who was refusing to show proper respect, who was somehow challenging their authority on their own campus. What they didn't see was a professional who had spent years in situations where reading people correctly was the difference between life and death. Marcus stepped closer, using his height advantage in the way he had been trained to project dominance. "Look, lady, this is a military installation. We don't just let random people wander around without knowing what they're up to. So why don't you explain exactly why you're here, and who gave you permission to be on this campus?" Sarah's eyes narrowed slightly. She could feel the familiar shift happening inside her, the way her training began to surface when confronted with aggression. But she also recognized that this was a teaching moment, both for these young men and potentially for herself. "But sometimes conflict found you anyway. I'm here to pick up documents for my brother," she said, her voice taking on a subtle edge that carried authority despite its quiet tone. "I have permission to be here, and I'm not causing any trouble. I suggest we all move on with our day." But Marcus was past the point where he could back down gracefully. His reputation among his peers was built on never showing weakness, never allowing disrespect to go unchallenged. He had misread the situation completely, interpreting Sarah's calm as weakness and her politeness as submission. "See, that's where you're wrong," Marcus said, his voice rising enough to attract attention from other cadets across the quad. "You're on my campus, and you'll show the proper respect to the uniform. Now I want to see some ID, and I want to know exactly who your brother is and what kind of documents you're picking up." The demand for ID was the final straw. Sarah had spent too many years having her identity questioned, her credentials challenged, her presence in male-dominated spaces treated as an intrusion. She had endured it when she was building her career, when she was proving herself, when she had something to gain by playing along. But she was past all that now. "No," she said simply. The word hung in the air like a thrown gauntlet. Marcus stared at her in disbelief. Nobody said no to him on this campus. Faculty showed him respect. Underclassmen jumped to obey his commands, and civilian visitors were generally intimidated enough by the military environment to comply with any reasonable request. "Excuse me?" Marcus said, his voice dangerously quiet. Sarah could see that the situation was spiraling beyond what any of these young men had intended. They weren't bad people, she realized, just overconfident and inexperienced. They had been trained to command, but not yet taught the wisdom that should come with authority.
They were about to learn a very expensive lesson about the difference between rank and actual power.
"I said no," Sarah repeated, her voice still calm but carrying an unmistakable note of finality.
"I'm not required to show you my identification. I'm not under your command, and I'm not going to be bullied by someone young enough to be my little brother." The insult hit Marcus harder than Sarah had intended. In front of his peers, his authority had just been publicly challenged and dismissed. The other cadets were watching now, waiting to see how their leader would handle this unprecedented situation. Marcus felt the weight of their expectations, the pressure to maintain his position in the hierarchy they had all spent 4 years building. What happened next would change everything for everyone involved. Marcus reached a decision that would haunt him for years to come, driven by pride and inexperience and a fundamental misunderstanding of who he was dealing with. He was about to discover that some battle should never be started, and that assuming weakness in others can be the most dangerous mistake a person can make. Sarah saw the moment when Marcus made his choice. She recognized the look in his eyes, the set of his shoulders, the way his companions unconsciously prepared to back his play. She had seen it countless times in her career, usually in men who were about to discover they had miscalculated badly. She took a deep breath and prepared herself for what was coming, knowing that the next few minutes would test everything she had learned about control, restraint, and the terrible responsibility that came with the kind of training she carried. Some lessons could only be taught the hard way, And Marcus Webb was about to enroll in a graduate course he would never forget. Marcus Webb had never been told no by a civilian on his campus, and the public nature of Sarah's refusal made backing down impossible. His reputation among the cadets was built on unwavering confidence and the ability to command respect through presence alone. To walk away now would undermine everything he had worked to establish over 4 years at the academy. "I think you misunderstand your situation here," Marcus said, his voice dropping to the tone he used when giving orders he expected to be obeyed without question. "This isn't a request anymore. I'm ordering you to produce identification and explain your business on this campus." Sarah almost smiled at the absurdity of it. Here was a 22-year-old cadet attempting to give her orders as if she were some random civilian who had wandered onto a military base by accident. If he only knew the orders she had followed, the mission she had completed, the life and death decision she had made while he was still in high school, he might have chosen a different approach. "You're not my commanding officer," Sarah said, her voice carrying a subtle but unmistakable edge of authority that made several nearby cadets unconsciously straighten their posture. "And you have no authority to order me to do anything." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. In his world, authority was everything. It was the foundation upon which military order was built, and having it challenged so publicly felt like a personal attack on everything he represented. His face flushed red as he realized that other cadets had stopped their activities to watch the confrontation unfold. James Chen, one of Marcus's closest friends and fellow senior cadet, stepped forward. James was destined for Navy intelligence, and his approach to problems was typically more analytical than Marcus's direct methods. He had been watching the exchange with growing concern, recognizing that the situation was escalating beyond what any of them had intended. "Look, ma'am," James said using his most diplomatic tone, "I think we all got off on the wrong foot here. We're just trying to maintain security protocols. If you could just show us your visitor's pass or explain who you're here to see, we can get this whole thing sorted out quickly." It was a reasonable request delivered politely, the kind of de-escalation technique that James had learned in his leadership courses. But Sarah could see that it was also a trap. If she complied now, she would be validating Marcus's authority to make demands of her. If she refused, she would appear unreasonable to anyone watching who didn't understand the full context. Sarah looked at James with something approaching respect. He was trying to find a face-saving solution for everyone involved. Under different circumstances, she might have worked with him. But Marcus had already poisoned the well by trying to assert dominance, and now any cooperation on her part would be seen as submission to his authority. "I appreciate your more polite approach," Sarah said to James, "but the principle remains the same. I'm not required to justify my presence here to any of you. I have legitimate business on this campus, and I'm conducting it appropriately." Marcus felt his authority slipping away with every word Sarah spoke. The other cadets were watching now, and some were beginning to murmur among themselves. He could see doubt creeping into their expressions as they processed the fact that this civilian woman was standing her ground against their senior leadership. "Enough," Marcus snapped, his military bearing becoming more pronounced as his frustration mounted. "You're coming with us to campus security. We'll let them sort out whether you belong here or not." He reached out to take Sarah's arm, intending to guide her toward the security office with the kind of firm but non-violent contact that military personnel were trained to use when dealing with uncooperative civilians. The moment his hand touched her arm, everything changed. Sarah's reaction was instantaneous and reflexive. Years of training kicked in before conscious thought could intervene. She twisted away from his grip with a fluid motion that looked almost casual but left Marcus grasping empty air, while she stepped smoothly out of his reach. "Don't touch me," she said, her voice suddenly carrying a coldness that made several cadets involuntarily step back. Marcus stared at his empty hand in confusion. He was a strong, athletic young man who had never had someone simply slip away from his grasp like that. The movement had been so smooth, so effortless, that for a moment he wasn't even sure what had happened. "How did you—" he started to say, then caught himself. He looked around and saw that the crowd of observers had grown larger. Word was spreading across the quad that something interesting was happening, and cadets were drifting over to see what was going on. Tyler Brooks, who had been silent until now, decided to insert himself into the situation. Tyler was the most aggressive of the group, destined for Marine infantry, and his solution to most problems involved the application of superior force. He had been growing increasingly frustrated watching Marcus struggle with one middle-aged woman. "This is ridiculous," Tyler said loudly enough for everyone to hear. 4 years, we've been training to be officers, and we're going to let some random civilian disrespect us on our own campus? I don't think so. Tyler was bigger than Marcus, with the kind of thick build that came from years of serious weightlifting. He stepped forward with the confidence of someone who had never lost a physical confrontation and couldn't imagine starting now. "Ma'am, you're going to come with us right now," Tyler said, his voice carrying the kind of barely controlled aggression that was meant to intimidate. "And if you don't cooperate, we're going to make sure you cooperate." Sarah felt a familiar chill settle over her. She recognized the tone, the posture, the implicit threat. This was the moment where talk ended and action began. These young men had no idea what they were walking into, but they had made their choice. They had decided that their authority was more important than restraint, that their egos were worth more than wisdom. "Back off," Sarah said quietly, her voice carrying a warning that anyone with combat experience would have recognized immediately. But Tyler had never been in combat. He had trained for it, studied it, prepared for it, but he had never felt the moment when violence shifted from possibility to inevitability. He read Sarah's quiet warning as fear, her stillness as submission waiting to happen. "I don't think you understand the situation you're in," Tyler said, moving closer. "There are 4 of us and 1 of you. You're outnumbered and outmatched. So you can either walk with us voluntarily, or we can carry you." David Rodriguez, the 4th member of the group, finally found his voice.
David was perhaps the most thoughtful of the 4 destined for Navy engineering, and he had been growing increasingly uncomfortable with the direction things were taking.
"Guys, maybe we should just call campus security and let them handle this," David said uncertainly.
This is getting out of hand, but it was too late for reasonable voices. Marcus and Tyler had invested too much of their pride in the confrontation to back down now, and James, despite his diplomatic instincts, wasn't willing to abandon his friends when they needed his support. "We are campus security," Marcus said firmly. "Senior cadets have the authority to detain uncooperative civilians until proper authorities can take custody. That's what we're doing here." Sarah almost laughed at the absurdity of it. These young men had convinced themselves that their training exercises and theoretical knowledge had prepared them for a real confrontation. They had no idea they were about to face someone who had spent years in situations where mistakes got people killed. "Last warning," Sarah said, her voice so quiet that people had to strain to hear her. "Walk away." Tyler interpreted her quiet tone as weakness. In his experience, people who were truly dangerous didn't give warnings. They acted. He had never encountered someone whose confidence was so complete that they could afford to be generous with second chances. "I'm tired of this," Tyler announced. He reached behind his back and pulled out something that made the entire situation take a dark turn. It was a training pistol, one of the realistic-looking replicas that cadets used for simulation exercises. To anyone watching from a distance, it looked exactly like the real thing. The gasps from the crowd of observing cadets were audible. Several of them stepped back, suddenly realizing that what had started as an interesting confrontation had become something much more serious. "Maybe this will help you understand the gravity of your situation," Tyler said, holding the training weapon in a way that suggested he was prepared to use it. "You're going to come with us right now, or things are going to get very unpleasant for you." Sarah looked at the weapon with the eye of someone who had been threatened with guns more times than she could count. Training weapon or not, Tyler was using it to threaten her, and that changed the rules completely. These cadets had just crossed a line they couldn't uncross. "Put that away," James said urgently. "Tyler, what are you doing? That's completely against regulations." "Nobody's going to report anything," Tyler said confidently. "Once we get her to security and they sort out that she doesn't belong here, everyone will understand that we were just doing our job."
Marcus felt a moment of uncertainty.
The training weapon was going too far, but he also knew that backing down now would be seen as weakness. He had started this confrontation, and his reputation depended on seeing it through to a successful conclusion. "Tyler's right," Marcus said, though he could hear the doubt in his own voice. "We have a responsibility to maintain order on this campus. If she won't cooperate voluntarily, we'll use whatever methods are necessary." Sarah looked at the 4 young men surrounding her and felt a familiar sadness. They were about to learn a lesson that would change them forever, and there was no way to teach it gently. Sometimes the only way people learned respect for real strength was by discovering how weak they actually were. The crowd of cadets watching from a safe distance had grown to nearly 30 people. Some were pulling out their phones, realizing that whatever happened next was going to be worth recording. Others were beginning to look uncomfortable, sensing that the situation had moved beyond the realm of normal campus discipline. Sarah took a deep breath and made her final attempt at de-escalation. She owed them that much, even if they had forfeited any right to her patience. "Young men," she said, her voice carrying across the quad with unmistakable authority, "you have approximately 10 seconds to put that weapon away and walk away from this situation. After that, I'm going to assume you represent a legitimate threat, and I will respond accordingly. The warning was delivered with such calm certainty that several of the watching cadets felt a chill run down their spines. There was something about Sarah's voice, about her complete lack of fear in the face of four larger, younger opponents, that suggested they were witnessing something far beyond a normal confrontation. Tyler, however, was beyond the reach of reason. He had committed himself to a course of action, and his pride wouldn't let him retreat.
10 seconds?
Tyler laughed harshly. Lady, I don't know what fantasy world you're living in, but this is reality. You're surrounded, outgunned, and out of options. The only choice you have left is whether you walk to security or get dragged there. Marcus felt the situation slipping beyond his control, but he couldn't find a way to retreat without losing face completely. James and David were looking increasingly uncomfortable, but neither was willing to abandon their friends when the confrontation reached its climax. Sarah looked at each of them in turn, memorizing their faces, noting their positions, calculating distances and angles with the automatic precision of someone trained in violence as a profession. She had given them every chance to avoid what was coming. Now it was time for them to learn why some people chose to walk quietly through the world, and what happened to those foolish enough to mistake restraint for weakness. The 10 seconds were almost up. What happened next took exactly 4 seconds, though to the watching cadets it seemed to unfold, both in slow motion and impossibly fast at the same time. Tyler never saw Sarah move. One moment she was standing 3 feet away, her hands empty and relaxed at her sides, appearing completely vulnerable to his training weapon. The next moment, the world turned upside down. Sarah's approach was textbook special operations. She moved diagonally forward, and to Tyler's right, slipping inside the arc where the training pistol could threaten her while simultaneously getting behind Tyler's field of vision. Her left hand trapped his gun hand against his body, while her right hand found the pressure point on his wrist that forced his fingers to open involuntarily. The training weapon clattered to the ground, as Tyler found himself spun around and controlled with a grip that felt like it could snap his arm if Sarah chose to apply just a little more pressure. She had positioned herself so that Tyler's body was between her and the other 3 cadets, making it impossible for them to intervene without going through their friend. "Don't move," Sarah said quietly, and Tyler discovered that he couldn't move even if he wanted to. The hold she had on him created a cascade of pressure points that turned any attempt at resistance into immediate, excruciating pain. Marcus stared in shock. Tyler Brooks was the strongest, most aggressive member of their group, and he had been neutralized so quickly and smoothly that Marcus hadn't even processed what he was seeing until it was over. The movement had been too fast, too precise, too professional to be anything other than advanced military training. "Let him go," Marcus shouted, though his voice cracked slightly as the implications of what he had just witnessed began to sink in. Sarah looked at Marcus over Tyler's shoulder, and he saw something in her eyes that made his blood run cold. It wasn't anger or aggression. It was the calm, calculating gaze of someone who was completely in control of the situation and was deciding how much damage she was willing to inflict. "I'm going to release him," Sarah said calmly. "And then I'm going to pick up documents for my brother and leave this campus. Anyone who tries to stop me will end up like him." She released Tyler, who stumbled forward and immediately began rubbing his wrist and shoulder. The expression on his face was one of complete bewilderment. In 4 years of intensive physical training, he had never encountered anyone who could control him so effortlessly. Sarah bent down and picked up the training weapon, examining it with the eye of someone intimately familiar with firearms. "Glock 19 training replica," she said matter-of-factly. "Decent weight distribution, but the trigger pull is completely wrong. Whoever was running your firearms training should have mentioned that." The casual way she handled and assessed the weapon sent another shock through the watching cadets. This wasn't someone who had learned about guns from movies or books. This was someone who spoke about them with the familiarity of professional experience. James Chen found his voice first. "Who are you?" he asked. "Oh. Who are you?" he asked, though part of him was no longer sure he wanted to know the answer. Sarah looked at him with something approaching sympathy. "I'm someone who was trained to handle situations like this," she said simply. "And you're cadets who just learned why that training exists." Marcus felt his world shifting beneath his feet. Everything about the confrontation had been wrong from the beginning. Sarah's calm confidence, her complete lack of intimidation in the face of superior numbers, her casual dismissal of their authority, and now her demonstration of combat skills that none of them had ever seen outside of advanced training videos. "You're military," Marcus said, though it came out more like a question than a statement. Was, Sarah corrected. I left the service to find some peace and quiet. Apparently that was too much to ask for. David Rodriguez, who had been silent throughout the confrontation, finally spoke up. What branch? He asked quietly. Sarah studied him for a moment, recognizing that he was genuinely trying to understand, rather than looking for another angle of attack.
Navy, she said.
What was your rate? David pressed, using the Navy term for job specialty. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, weighing how much to reveal. These young men had already learned a hard lesson about assumptions and authority. The question was whether they were ready for the full truth. Special operations, she said finally. The words hit the gathered cadets like a physical blow. Special operations in the Navy meant only one thing that could explain the skills they had just witnessed. Several of the watching cadets gasped audibly, and Marcus felt his knees go weak. You're a SEAL, James whispered, his voice carrying a mixture of awe and horror at the realization of how catastrophically they had misjudged the situation. Sarah didn't confirm or deny it, but her silence was answer enough. The watching cadets began to murmur among themselves, the story spreading through the crowd in hushed, excited whispers. Word was already racing across the campus through text messages and social media. The cadets who had threatened a Navy SEAL with a training weapon were about to become the most famous students in Academy history, and not in a good way. Tyler was still rubbing his wrist, staring at Sarah with a mixture of respect and embarrassment that made him look much younger than his 22 years. How long did you serve? He asked quietly. 12 years, Sarah replied. 6 as a SEAL. Marcus felt his stomach drop. 6 years as a SEAL meant Sarah had seen combat, had been deployed to places where the skills she had just demonstrated weren't theoretical exercises, but matters of life and death. She had probably faced real enemies with real weapons in real situations where failure meant death. How many deployments? David asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah looked at him with tired eyes. Enough. The simple answer carried more weight than a detailed recounting could have. Everyone present understood that enough meant more than any of them could imagine, more than their training had prepared them for, more than they wanted to know. James Chen had gone completely pale. As someone destined for Navy intelligence, he understood better than the others what Sarah's background meant. SEALs weren't just elite soldiers. They were weapons of surgical precision, trained to operate in situations where normal military units couldn't function. They were the people you sent when failure wasn't an option. Ma'am, James said formally, I want to apologize for our behavior. We made assumptions that were completely inappropriate, and we treated you with disrespect that you didn't deserve. Sarah nodded acknowledgement of his apology, but her expression remained neutral. An apology couldn't undo the fact that they had threatened her with a weapon, even a training weapon. In the real world, such an action could have justified a lethal response. Marcus was struggling to find words. His entire self-image had been built around being a leader, being someone who could handle any situation through strength and authority. The realization that he had been completely outmatched from the beginning, that Sarah had been showing restraint rather than weakness, was devastating to his confidence. We didn't know, Marcus said lamely, though even as he said it he realized how inadequate the words were. That's exactly the problem, Sarah replied, her voice carrying a hardness that made several cadets step back unconsciously. You didn't know, but you assumed. You saw someone you thought was weak, someone you thought you could intimidate, and you decided that your authority gave you the right to threaten them. She looked around at the crowd of watching cadets, her gaze taking in their shocked faces, their mixture of excitement and embarrassment at witnessing such a public demonstration of their seniors' poor judgment. What if I hadn't been trained to handle this situation, Sarah continued, her voice carrying across the quad. What if I had been exactly what you thought I was?
A regular civilian, maybe someone's mother or sister, just trying to complete some simple business on your campus?
The question hung in the air like an accusation. The watching cadets began to understand that they hadn't just witnessed a physical confrontation, but a complete failure of leadership and judgment by the very people they looked up to as examples.
Tyler, who was still flexing his hand to make sure nothing was permanently damaged, found his voice. Would you have hurt us if we had kept pushing? Sarah looked at him with something that might have been sympathy. I was trained to neutralize threats using the minimum necessary force, she said carefully. But when someone threatens me with a weapon, even a training weapon, the definition of necessary changes significantly. The implication was clear. If they had escalated further, if they had actually tried to carry out their threats, Sarah would have been justified in responding with whatever level of force she deemed appropriate. The fact that they were all still standing and uninjured was a testament to her restraint, not their strength. Marcus felt a crushing weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. He had led his friends into a situation that could have ended with any or all of them seriously injured. His poor judgment and inflated ego had nearly resulted in a confrontation that would have destroyed their careers before they even began. "What happens now?" Marcus asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Sarah considered the question. She could report the incident to campus security, which would likely result in disciplinary action that could end their military careers before they started. She could file a police report for assault with a weapon, which would result in criminal charges. She could simply leave and let them live with the knowledge of how badly they had misjudged the situation. "Now," Sarah said finally, "I'm going to pick up documents for my brother, and then I'm going to leave. And you four are going to think very carefully about what you learned today." She started to walk away, then paused and turned back. "A word of advice for your future military careers," she said, her voice carrying the authority of experience. "Real strength doesn't need to announce itself. Real authority doesn't require threats. And real leaders know the difference between confidence and arrogance." The crowd of watching cadets began to disperse, many of them pulling out their phones to share what they had witnessed. The story would spread across the campus within hours, and by evening it would be military legend. The 4 senior cadets who had threatened a Navy SEAL and lived to tell about it. But as Sarah walked away toward Building C, the 4 young men who had started the confrontation were left standing in the quad, dealing with the realization that everything they thought they knew about strength, authority, and leadership had just been turned upside down by a quiet woman in civilian clothes who had shown them more about real power in 4 seconds than they had learned in 4 years of military training. The walk to Building C felt like the longest journey of Marcus Webb's life. Word of the confrontation had spread across the campus with the speed that only military institutions could achieve. Cadets who had witnessed the encounter were already sharing videos and photos on social media, and the story was growing with each retelling. Sarah found Building C without further incident, though she noticed that cadets who passed her in the hallways gave her a wide berth and more respectful nods than she had received earlier. News traveled fast in closed communities, and by now every cadet on campus knew that the quiet woman in civilian clothes was someone who commanded serious respect. Meanwhile, back in the quad, Marcus and his 3 companions were dealing with the immediate aftermath of their humiliation. Other cadets approached them with a mixture of curiosity, sympathy, and barely concealed amusement. The story was already taking on mythical proportions as it spread from person to person. "Is it true she's a Navy SEAL?" asked Jennifer Walsh, a junior cadet who had heard the story third hand and wasn't sure what to believe. "Was a SEAL," Tyler corrected automatically, still massaging his wrist where Sarah's grip had controlled him so effortlessly. The distinction felt important, though he wasn't sure why. 6 years active duty, James added quietly, multiple deployments. The numbers meant something different to military personnel than they did to civilians. 6 years as a Navy SEAL represented countless missions, extensive combat experience, and survival through some of the most dangerous operations the military conducted. It meant Sarah had been tested in ways none of them could imagine, and had proven herself repeatedly in situations where failure meant death. "What did you guys do to piss her off?" asked another cadet, and Marcus felt his face burn with embarrassment. "We made assumptions," David said quietly, speaking for the first time since the confrontation ended. "We saw someone we thought didn't belong here, and we decided it was our job to put her in her place." The admission hung in the air like a confession. Other cadets shifted uncomfortably, recognizing that the same assumptions could have easily been made by any of them. The difference was that Marcus and his friends had acted on their assumptions, and they had been spectacularly wrong. News of the incident reached the Academy's administration within an hour. Commander Patricia Reynolds, the officer of the day, received 3 separate reports about a confrontation between senior cadets and a civilian visitor. The reports were confusing and contradictory, but they all agreed on one thing. The civilian had demonstrated combat skills that suggested military special operations background. Commander Reynolds pulled the campus security footage and watched the encounter with growing concern. The video clearly showed the 4 cadets confronting Sarah, the escalation to threatening her with a training weapon, and her swift neutralization of Tyler Brooks. It was exactly the kind of incident that could generate negative media attention for the Academy and raise serious questions about cadet discipline and training. More troubling was the fact that the cadets had acted completely outside proper protocols. There were established procedures for dealing with suspicious civilians on campus, and none of those procedures involved senior cadets conducting their own interrogations or making threats with training weapons. Sarah completed her business in Building C without incident. Professor Michael Hartley, Jake's academic advisor, was apologetic about the paperwork taking longer than expected and offered her coffee while they waited for the final documents to be processed. He seemed oblivious to any drama on the campus, focused entirely on ensuring that Jake's deployment paperwork was in order. "Your brother is one of our finest cadets," Professor Hartley told Sarah as he organized the documents. "He's going to make an excellent naval officer. You should be very proud of him." Sarah smiled genuinely for the first time since arriving on campus. "I am proud of him. He's wanted this since he was 12 years old." "Military family?" Professor Hartley asked conversationally.
"Our father was Navy," Sarah replied, which was true but not the whole truth. She had learned long ago that conversations about her own service tended to become complicated, especially when people realized what she had done.
When the paperwork was complete, Sarah thanked Professor Hartley and made her way back across campus toward the parking area. The quad where the confrontation had occurred was nearly empty now, with only a few cadets moving between buildings. The normal rhythm of campus life had resumed, though Sarah noticed that the cadets she passed seemed more aware of her presence than they had been earlier. Marcus Webb was in his dormitory room, staring at his computer screen and trying to write a report about the incident. As a senior cadet, he was required to document any unusual occurrences that happened under his watch, but he was struggling to find words that would explain what had happened without making himself and his friends look completely incompetent. How do you explain that you threatened someone with a training weapon without knowing who they were? How do you document that you were professionally humiliated by someone you had assumed was weak and helpless? How do you write a report that would inevitably be read by senior officers who would question every decision you had made? Tyler knocked on Marcus's door and entered without waiting for permission. His wrist was still sore, and his pride was bruised even worse than his body. "Have you written the report yet?" Tyler asked, slumping into the chair across from Marcus's desk. "I don't know what to write," Marcus admitted. "Whatever I put down is going to make us look terrible. We look terrible because we acted terribly," Tyler said with uncharacteristic honesty. "There's no way to write this report that makes us look good, because there's nothing about what we did that was good. The admission was painful but necessary." Tyler had spent the past hour replaying the confrontation in his mind, trying to identify the exact moment where things had gone wrong. The conclusion he had reached was uncomfortable. Everything had been wrong from the very beginning. James Chen appeared in the doorway, followed by David Rodriguez. The four friends who had started the day as confident senior cadets were now united in their shared humiliation and growing understanding of how badly they had misjudged the situation. "I talked to my father," James said quietly. His father was a Navy captain with 30 years of service, and James had called him hoping for advice on how to handle the aftermath of the incident. "What did he say?" Marcus asked, though he suspected he wouldn't like the answer. "He said we're lucky to still be breathing," James replied bluntly. "He said that threatening a combat veteran with a weapon, even a training weapon, was the kind of mistake that could have gotten us killed in the real world." The words hit like physical blows. Captain Chen had not been sympathetic to his son's situation, and his assessment of their actions had been brutally honest. "He also said," James continued, "that the fact that she showed restraint and walked away says more about her character than anything else. He said most special operations veterans wouldn't have been nearly so patient with a bunch of arrogant cadets who didn't know what they were dealing with." David had been quiet throughout the day, processing what had happened and trying to understand the lessons they were supposed to learn from it. As an engineering student, he approached problems systematically, and he had been analyzing their encounter with Sarah like a failed experiment. "We violated every principle of good leadership," David said, finally. "We made assumptions without gathering facts. We escalated a situation instead of de-escalating it. We used intimidation instead of communication. We threatened force instead of showing restraint." The analysis was methodical and damning. Each point represented a fundamental failure of the leadership principles they had spent 4 years learning. "And worst of all," David continued, "we did it all in public, in front of cadets who look up to us as examples. We didn't just fail ourselves, we failed everyone who's supposed to learn from us." Marcus felt the weight of that responsibility settling on his shoulders like a physical burden. As senior cadets, they were supposed to be role models for the younger students. Instead, they had demonstrated exactly how not to handle authority and responsibility. A knock on the door interrupted their grim discussion. "Come in," Marcus called, expecting another friend or doormate. Instead, Commander Reynolds entered the room, her expression serious and professional. All four cadets immediately stood at attention, recognizing that this was not a social visit. Gentlemen, Commander Reynolds said, I think we need to discuss what happened in the quad this afternoon. Sarah Mitchell was driving north on Interstate 95, the Academy visible in her rearview mirror for the last time. The documents for Jake were safely in her passenger seat, and she had completed the task that had brought her to campus.
She should have felt satisfied with a job well done. But instead she found herself reflecting on the encounter with the 4 cadets. They weren't bad young men, she realized. They were just inexperienced and overconfident in the way that many people their age were. They had been trained to lead and command, but they hadn't yet learned the wisdom that should come with authority. The military would teach them that wisdom eventually, probably through hard experience and difficult lessons. Sarah's phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. The caller ID showed Jake's number calling from his base in Virginia. Hey sis, Jake's voice came through the car's speakers.
Did you get the documents from Professor Hartley?
Got them, Sarah confirmed. They're sitting right next to me.
Any problems on campus? Jake asked casually.
I know it can be a little intimidating for civilians. Sarah almost laughed at the irony of the question. Nothing I couldn't handle, she said diplomatically. Thanks for doing this for me, Jake said. I know it was a long drive and I really appreciate it. Anything for my little brother, Sarah replied, and she meant it. Jake was one of the few people in the world who knew about her military service, and he was the only person who had never treated her differently because of it. To him, she would always be his big sister who had taught him to ride a bike and helped him with his homework. Ways aside from being present. I'll see you at graduation in 2 months, Jake said. And Sarah? Try to stay out of trouble between now and then. If only he knew, Sarah thought as she ended the call and continued her drive north, toward the quiet life she had built for herself in Maine. Behind her, 4 young men were learning hard lessons about respect, authority, and the difference between rank and real power. Ahead of her lay the peace and quiet she had earned through 12 years of service in places where peace and quiet were rare and precious commodities. The incident at the Naval Academy would become military legend within weeks, passed down through generations of cadets as a cautionary tale about assumptions and humility. But for Sarah Mitchell, it was just another reminder that some lessons could only be learned the hard way, and that sometimes the most dangerous person in any situation was the one who looked like they didn't belong there at all. The road stretched out ahead of her, leading home. Commander Reynolds closed the door behind her and looked at the 4 cadets standing at rigid attention. The silence stretched for a long moment as she studied each of their faces, noting the mixture of shame, anxiety, and dawning understanding in their expressions. At ease, she said finally, though none of them relaxed completely. Sit down. We have a lot to discuss. The 4 cadets took seats around Marcus's small dormitory room, their usual confidence replaced by the kind of nervous energy that came with knowing they had made a serious mistake and were about to face the consequences. Commander Reynolds had spent 2 hours reviewing the security footage, reading witness statements, and trying to understand how 4 of her top senior cadets had managed to create such a spectacular failure of leadership and judgment. Her investigation had revealed details that made the situation even more concerning than the initial reports had suggested. First, Commander Reynolds began, "Let me tell you what I know. I know that you confronted a civilian visitor without cause. I know that you demanded identification without authority to do so. I know that you escalated a simple misunderstanding into a threat situation. And I know that you did all of this in public, in front of dozens of other cadets who looked to you for leadership."
Each point hit like a hammer blow.
The cadets had hoped that perhaps the situation wasn't as bad as they remembered, but Commander Reynolds' summary made it clear that their recollections were, if anything, understating the seriousness of their actions. But what concerns me most, Commander Reynolds continued, is not what you did, but what you didn't do. You didn't follow established protocols for dealing with suspicious civilians. You didn't attempt to de-escalate the situation. You didn't seek assistance from proper authorities, and most importantly, you didn't recognize when you were completely out of your depth. Tyler shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Ma'am, we didn't know she was military." Commander Reynolds fixed him with a look that could have frozen seawater.
That's exactly the problem, Cadet Brooks. You didn't know who she was, but you assumed she was someone you could intimidate and threaten. What if she had been a visiting dignitary? What if she had been a member of Congress? What if she had been the wife of a senior officer? The questions hung in the air like accusations. Each scenario represented a career-ending mistake that could have resulted from the same poor judgment they had displayed. The fact that she turned out to be a decorated Navy SEAL is almost beside the point, Commander Reynolds said. Your behavior would have been equally inappropriate regardless of who she was. James found his voice. "Ma'am, what's going to happen to us?" Commander Reynolds studied him for a moment. "That depends on several factors. First,
whether the civilian in question decides to file a formal complaint. Second, whether the incident generates negative media attention for the academy. And third, whether you demonstrate that you understand the gravity of what you've done and are capable of learning from it. Marcus felt his stomach drop. The possibility of formal charges hadn't occurred to him, but now that Commander Reynolds mentioned it, he realized that Sarah would have been well within her rights to file assault charges against all of them. The fact that she hadn't done so was an act of mercy they didn't deserve. Has Ms. Mitchell filed any complaints? David asked quietly. Ms. Mitchell? Commander Reynolds raised an eyebrow. So you do know her name. Interesting that you didn't bother to ask for it during your confrontation. The rebuke stung because it was accurate. They had demanded her identification, while never bothering to introduce themselves or explain their authority to make such demands. No, Commander Reynolds continued, she has not filed any complaints. She completed her business on campus and left without reporting the incident. Which, gentlemen, is the only reason you're sitting in this room having a conversation instead of sitting in the brig awaiting court-martial. The relief was palpable, but Commander Reynolds wasn't finished. However, she said, that doesn't mean there won't be consequences. The Academy has a responsibility to address serious failures of leadership and judgment, especially when they involve senior cadets who are supposed to be examples for the rest of the Corps.
She opened a folder she had been carrying and placed several documents on Marcus's desk. These are the witness statements from cadets who observed the incident.
23 different accounts, all consistent in their description of your behavior. The story is already spreading beyond the campus through social media and text messages.
The implications were clear. Even if Sarah didn't file formal complaints, the incident was becoming public knowledge.
The Academy's reputation was tied to the conduct of its cadets, and this kind of story could generate exactly the kind of negative attention that military institutions worked hard to avoid. What's our recommendation, ma'am? Marcus asked, using the formal phrase that indicated he was ready to accept whatever consequences were deemed appropriate.
Commander Reynolds studied him for a long moment. The recommendation depends on what you've learned from this experience and how you plan to apply those lessons going forward. She stood and walked to the window overlooking the quad where the confrontation had taken place.
Several cadets were moving across the open space, their conversations animated and obviously focused on the day's events. Tell me, Commander Reynolds said without turning around, what did you learn today? Marcus exchanged glances with his friends, realizing that this was a test as important as any they had taken during their 4 years at the Academy.
We learned that assumptions can be dangerous, Marcus began carefully. We assumed that because someone didn't look like they belonged on a military campus, they were somehow inferior to us or threatening to our authority. We learned that real authority doesn't require threats, James added. Ms. Mitchell had more actual authority in her little finger than we had collectively, but she never used it to intimidate or threaten anyone. Tyler nodded agreement. We learned that physical strength and weapons don't make you powerful if you don't have the judgment to use them appropriately. She could have hurt any of us seriously, but she chose restraint instead. David had been thinking about the larger implications of their failure. We learned that leadership isn't about asserting dominance over people you think are weaker than you. Real leadership is about protecting people and making good decisions even when you're under pressure. Commander Reynolds turned back to face them. Those are good lessons, she said, but they're only valuable if you remember them when you're faced with real leadership challenges in your military careers. She returned to her seat and opened another folder. I've been in contact with Sarah Mitchell's former commanding officer. Captain William Morrison served with her during 3 deployments and was kind enough to share some insights about her service record. The cadets leaned forward slightly, curiosity overcoming their nervousness. According to Captain Morrison, Commander Reynolds continued, Petty Officer Mitchell was one of the most capable SEALs he ever had the privilege of commanding. She completed missions that most of her male counterparts couldn't have handled. She saved lives, eliminated threats, and served with distinction in some of the most dangerous places on Earth. The description painted a picture of someone so far beyond their own level of experience and capability that their attempt to intimidate her seemed not just foolish but almost surreal. Captain Morrison also told me, Commander Reynolds said, that Sarah Mitchell retired from active duty because she was tired of fighting. She wanted to find peace and build a quiet life away from conflict and violence. She came to our campus today to help her brother, not looking for trouble. The implication was clear. Sarah had been seeking peace, and they had forced conflict upon her. She had been trying to avoid exactly the kind of situation they had created. So, Commander Reynolds said, closing the folder, here's what's going to happen. You 4 are going to write detailed reports about this incident, analyzing your failures and the lessons you learned. You're going to present those reports to the entire senior class as case studies in leadership failure. And you're going to spend the remaining weeks of your time here demonstrating that you understand what real leadership looks like. The punishment was fair, but humiliating. Having to present their failures to their peers would be a constant reminder of their poor judgment, but it would also serve as a teaching tool for other cadets. Additionally, Commander Reynolds continued, "You're going to write formal letters of apology to Miss Mitchell, acknowledging your inappropriate behavior and thanking her for her restraint in not filing charges against you." Marcus felt a wave of relief mixed with continued shame. The consequences were serious, but not career-ending. They would graduate, receive their commissions, and have the opportunity to prove themselves as officers. But they would do so with the knowledge that their first real test of leadership had been a spectacular failure. "One final thing," Commander Reynolds said as she prepared to leave. "This incident has already become Academy legend. To the rest of your careers, when people hear your names, some of them will remember you as the cadets who threatened a Navy SEAL. That reputation will follow you wherever you go." She stood and moved toward the door, then paused. "But reputations can be changed through consistent good service and sound leadership. You have the rest of your careers to prove that this was a learning experience rather than an indicator of your character." After Commander Reynolds left, the four friends sat in silence, processing what had happened and what it meant for their futures. The immediate crisis had passed, but the larger implications were still sinking in. 2 months later, at their graduation ceremony, Marcus Webb stood at attention as he received his commission as a second lieutenant in the Marine Corps. His parents beamed with pride from the audience, but Marcus found himself scanning the crowd for a different face. She was there, sitting quietly in the back section reserved for family members. Sarah Mitchell had come to watch her brother Jake receive his commission as an ensign in the Navy. She was wearing a simple blue dress and looked exactly like what she was, someone's proud sister attending a family milestone. After the ceremony, Marcus approached her hesitantly. He had written her a letter of apology as required, but had never received a response. He wasn't sure if she would even remember him.
"Miss Mitchell," he said quietly.
"I'm Marcus Webb. I wanted to thank you." Sarah turned and studied him for a moment.
"Thank me for what?" "For showing restraint," Marcus said. "For not filing charges."
"For giving us a chance to learn from our mistakes." Sarah nodded slightly. "How did you learn from them?" Marcus thought about the question seriously.
I learned that real strength comes from restraint, not aggression.
I learned that leadership means protecting people, not intimidating them. And I learned that the most dangerous mistake you can make is assuming you're the strongest person in any situation.
"Good lessons," Sarah said simply. "Make sure you remember them." She started to walk away, then paused. "Officer Webb?" "Yes, ma'am. Your brother told me you're going to be leading Marines. They're going to be depending on you to make good decisions under pressure. Don't let them down." Marcus watched her rejoin her family, understanding that he had just received forgiveness and a charge to do better. The incident that had nearly ended his career before it started had instead become the foundation for the kind of leader he was determined to become. Years later, when Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Webb told his Marines about the importance of humility and respect, he would often reference a day when 4 arrogant cadets learned about real strength from a quiet woman who could have destroyed them but chose instead to teach them. It was a lesson none of them ever forgot, and one they made sure to pass on to every person they ever had the privilege to lead.
Sarah Mitchell returned to her quiet life in Maine, but the legend of the Navy SEAL who taught 4 cadets about respect became part of military folklore, passed down through generations of officers who understood that sometimes the most important lessons come from the people who look like they have the least to teach.